Welcome back to Theater Journal Shorts. I'm here today with Luíza Bastos speaking about Performing Racial Democracy as Erotic Fantasy, which is out in our December 2025 issue on the transnational erotic. That's Theater Journal Volume 77, Number 4. Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to have the opportunity to learn more about your recent publication in Theater Journal and share this with our viewers and readers. I was wondering if you could start off by just giving us a brief summary of the topic of your article and your main argument in it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So in this paper, I do a close reading of the solo performance O Samba do Crioulo Doido by queer Afro-Brazilian artist Luíza Abreu. And in my reading of this performance, I interpret it as inciting reflection on how the Brazilian nationalist idea of racial democracy operates as an erotic fantasy, a white erotic fantasy that is predicated on the subjection of Blackness. For the audiences that are not so familiar with racial relations in Brazil and in Latin America more broadly, the myth of racial democracy as the ideology of mestiçagem is known in Brazil argues basically that interracial reproductive sex allows for a social structure of racial egalitarianism despite centuries of slavocracy in Brazil. What this means is that this ideology presupposes that the prevalence of miscegenation serves as evidence of the lack of racial antagonisms. So, however, like the work of various scholars have shown, scholars who work on race relations in Latin America have shown that despite centuries of interracial mixture, racial hierarchies and racial violence are alive and well and continue to structure Brazilian social life. And in fact, such appeal to interracial reproductive sex and familial intimacy actually obscures not only these racial hierarchies upon which these nations are built, but crucially, the sexual violation that was central to the institution of conquest, of slavery, and of these very nations, such as Brazil. So, in analyzing o samba do crioulo doido, I see that the artist de Abreu mobilizes satire and the most iconic signs of Brazilian national culture as a way to interrogate how the production of Blackness is engendered through a history of sexual violence, as well as how the narrative of racial democracy depends on the disavowal of such racial and sexual terror. So in my reading, I see the performance displaying on stage an ungendered and unsexed Black body surrounded by nationalist iconography. And by doing so, the performance constructs a mood of seduction, particularly through sensual body movements and the invocation of the figure of the mulata, which really came to be a sign of the nation. And this mood of seduction is presented as inseparable from the history of slavery and from the sexual violation that engenders racial subjection and racial hierarchies. So, in the way I see it, in the way as I read the piece, by bringing to light the racialized erotic desires that really underpin the exercise of power, Usamba allows me to argue, to build the argument that the Brazilian nationalist narrative of racial democracy is a performance of a white erotic fantasy. And what I mean by that is that when racial democracy claims racial equality in a social fabric that's actually, in fact, is structured by racialized subjection, this narrative, this white fantasy, allows the nation to perform passivity and neutrality while cultivating and exercising domination. This means that whiteness's desire for domination is obscured, is repressed, and at the same time, it is actualized through an enactment of submission in the form of racial neutrality. So, in this fantasy, whiteness discursively abdicates of power in order to access pleasure. That means like whiteness is performing racial neutrality under its own rule of engagement. So whiteness sets the rules of the game and meanwhile plays as if it was not enacting dominance, right? And this is the fantasy. A fantasy which puts forth a narrative of post-raciality as if race no longer structures our reality, which is not the case, of equal access to power, and all of that really deepens the collective denial of Black subjection that continues to structure Brazilian social life. So while Samba situates the audience in a history in which racial and sexual terror have been foundational to Brazil, the performance will also gesture to the political potential of Black queer desires and the ways in which Black pleasures, including Black fantasies of submission, can constitute fleeting moments of excess, fleeting moments of a feeling of liberation from the determinations from modernity, from the imposition of Blackness as ontological negation, as nothingness.
That's all, it's amazingly layered and nuanced. And also, I think one of the things that's so powerful about the intervention you're making is you're touching on a lot of topics that, in the context of theater and performance studies in the US, in North America, we hear more often evoked in relation to conversations and works about Blackness, whiteness, democracy, desire, pleasure, but in a very US rooted context. And so I'm so grateful to you for bringing in this other context where we can see similar issues playing out in very localized and different ways. But I think so important to acknowledge that, the issues that so often get discussed here in the US are not unique to our contexts.
Right.
So thank you so much for that. I'd love to hear more about, if you don't mind, how you came to this topic.
So I can say that I came to this topic and to this argument through my encounter with the performance piece itself. Of course, also in connection to my larger research and investigation in racial relations and cultural production in Brazil and Latin America. And I first saw the piece in 2023 in the 35th São Paulo Biennial, titled Choreographies of the Impossible. But Usamba was actually debuted in 2004, and it has been presented in various venues in Brazil and abroad ever since. And in this over 20 years, samba really became a paradigmatic performance art piece in Brazil. And the way I understand it is that like the fact that it continues to be reenacted and to be so significant indicates for me that despite the very significant gains that the Black movement has had since the early 2000s in Brazil, it really indicates and speaks to the fact of how racial democracy remains pervasive and remains a narrative that shapes and structures Brazilian social life.
That's really interesting. I'm stuck on choreographies of the impossible. What a fantastic title, theme for the festival. You started to touch on this a little bit by referencing your broader research topics, but I would love if could you talk a little bit more about how this particular article connects to some of the other things you're researching, or maybe even more broadly than that, to interventions you're interested in making in the field?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so my research is focused on the ways in which Black artistic practices interrogate and potentially corrode the truth value of knowledge claims and fantasies produced within the ontoepistemological structure of Western modernity, particularly around what it means to be human. And this paper is one of my experiments in this direction, in trying to really shape what a research like that could look like. One experiment in thinking about my dissertation project, really. And I think that the paper, in a way, attempts to demonstrate how performance can, even if transiently, even if momentarily, bring to the stage and to the social sphere those structuring elements of social reality that are kept behind the scenes, that larger narratives try to obscure, such as racial democracy.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you say that because I feel like in my conversations with authors for this issue, that particular facet of what theater, what performance, what dance can do has come out and again and again. So something about this theme of the transnational erotic really seems to help to get to that. Um, so the last question I have really is one of my hopes for these videos is that they might be helpful for assigning to students, especially undergraduates, as a kind of preview of the article, as well as a little bit of a guide for how to read it. So I was wondering if you could speak to the major takeaways you might have for the general reader or the undergraduate reader about what you would like them to come away from your article with, or maybe how it connects to broader trends in contemporary performance.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Um, so I think one thing, and even though I don't make this argument overtly in the text, Um, I believe that the article, in a way, gestures to a possibility of engagement with cultural production and artistic practices at large as modes of knowledge production and as modes of theorizing. And I think that, like, when I reflect back and say that I came to this argument through my encounter with the performance, is an example of that. Um, so I hope that the piece, in a way, inspires the audience at large to reflect on the corporeal and sensorial ways in which knowledge can be produced. And of course, on the potential of engaging with such cultural texts as such, as modes of theorizing, and how we can learn from them, and how we can also further theorize when reading them and when engaging with the knowledge, with the body of knowledge that they are putting forth. I think the really central, crucial takeaways from the article are first, understanding Blackness as a condition of possibility for what I call in the paper Brasilidade, Brazilianness. So this means that Brazilian national identity and the notion of a Brazilian essence are really predicated on consuming, metabolizing, and incorporating Blackness, while ultimately also excreting the raw materiality of Blackness from the national body. So we have a paradox of sorts in which Blackness is fundamental for the discursive, for the material construction of the nation, while being continuously erased and annihilated by it, violated by the state and by whiteness. Yeah. So we have a scene of extreme violence here, which is central for sustaining the nation. And I think the other central takeaway lies really around the polyvalence of sex. First, following the work of Black feminists, I explore the ways in which sexual violence has instituted racial subjection, and race as an axis of power that continues to sustain Western modernity. So I think that's a central takeaway from the text. And then following de Abreu's corporeal theorization and also the work of Black feminists, I also look at the ways in which sexual pleasures and fantasies can be experienced as fleeting moments of excess, as fleeting moments in which there is a sensorial experience of freedom, even if very transiently. And so these transient moments of sexual pleasure can be engaged really as moments in which one may feel themselves beyond the categorical impositions of modernity. And yeah, I think that's another main takeaway of from the paper.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us today. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our viewers before we wrap up?
Well, I am very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I am looking forward to continue to be in conversation with the journal's audience.
Great. Thank you so much. So just a reminder for everyone who's watching this, I'm here today with Luíza Bastos Lajas speaking about Performing Racial Democracy as Erotic Fantasy, which is out in volume 77, issue 4 of Theater Journal. That's our December 2025 special issue on the transnational erotic. Thank you again so much for your time and for joining me and sharing so much about your fascinating work.
Thank you.